talk, which I'm sure that we're all excited to be able to get a chance to witness in person. This recording will be videoed and is being recorded now. And so that if some have to leave early or there are delays in people attending, they can always watch this recording at a later time. Well, first, John Warden. Who is John Warden? Some of you may not know that he's an American patriot, a warrior, a founder, an executive, a strategist, an author, and a speaker. And I have a short bio from his website. That is, the name of the website is winningpeerwars.com. And I highly encourage you to go take a look at the website. It has a lot of valuable information and a lot pertaining to what Mr. Warden, John, is going to talk about today. Well, John A. Warden III, Colonel, U.S. Air Force, retired, is the president of Venturist Incorporated, the company that he founded after retiring from the Air Force in 1995. His company helps organizations and corporations learn and execute the concepts of winning strategy. Venturist clients have included Texas Instruments, McDonald's, government agencies like our agency at the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board, and many others. His diverse background includes serving as the architect, and I'm saying that with special emphasis, the architect for the successful Gulf War 1991 Desert Storm air campaign, authoring the best-selling and mandatory reading at many of the courses that I took, the best-selling book that is entitled The Air Campaign, heading the Air Force's Air Command Staff College, working as a special assistant to the Vice President of the United States, commanding the 36th Tactical Fighter Wing, those are F-15s, in Germany, and flying in the Vietnam War with 266 combat missions. A real warrior, sir. His business strategy book, it's entitled Winning in Fast Time, is available online and in selected stores, as well as The Air Campaign. He has produced many videos and has published numerous articles on planning, strategy, and aerospace power, and has appeared on many television and radio shows, and has spoken to groups ranging from the American Bar Association to the senior military professional education schools, not only in the United States, but across our allies in Australia, Singapore, etc. John graduated from the United States Air Force Academy in 1965. He completed pilot training in 1966, and earned a master's degree from the Texas Tech University in 1975. He also graduated from National War College in Washington, D.C. in 1986. His military decorations include the Distinguished Service Medal, the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, Distinguished Flying Cross, and Air Medal with 10, I say again, 10 oak leaf clusters. He has over 3,000 hours of flying time. Wow. What a career and what contributions you have made, sir. So with that, sir, over to you.
Tom, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you particularly for the invitation to speak with this group. Obviously, a very critical part of what we are as a country, certainly from the military standpoint. So again, Tom, thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to be speaking with this group, and especially with a group that around the world as this is. I want to get something off the screen here. There we go. So the title really, I think, is the starting point for this, and it is China, the military threat. But the emphasis here is not what we kind of have come to think about as the military threat, and that being something over Taiwan and kind of another replay of Korea, but located a few miles away. But this is really a discussion about the potential Chinese military threat to the U.S. homeland. And you all, this audience, you all are intimately familiar with all of our own military capability, probably pretty up on where China is too from their equipment standpoint. You certainly have a great understanding of the United States infrastructure and the way that we're set up. So I hope I'm not going to be telling you anything that you already know, but going to be trying to address how that what we know is influenced significantly by some things that really have developed over the last 25, 30 years with new concepts of operation that give a completely different impact to a lot of the technology that is out there or not out there on one side or the other. So with that, what I would like to do is to start with just a little bit of quick history as to how we got to where we are now. So you say, oh my gosh, I didn't know you were talking about that much history, but I think this is sort of fascinating. That is, as I think about the United States and all of the things that we've done since our founding, the peak of our vulnerability, the most vulnerable that we have ever been, was in fact in August of 1814, and it was right there in Washington. Very shortly thereafter, that vulnerability began to decrease and to go away. And from the Treaty of Ghent, which basically took the British off the boards as a dangerous enemy, to the development of what turned out to be the world's strongest navy, to a very extensive system of coastal fortifications. In fact, it's my understanding that our coastal defense was our most expensive military program that we had for about 50, 75 years. Then moving into the last century, where air power came along and we ended up with the most powerful air force in the world, gave us genuine invulnerability from attack. But probably the most significant part of that really is the two oceans, that we have simply felt ourselves to be utterly invulnerable. And we have been invulnerable for over 200 years. Wasn't too long ago, like 50 years or so ago, that we ended up beginning to see some chinks in this armor. With the Soviet nuclear test explosion in 1949, the development of the very long range Soviet aviation, and then a few years after that, with the advent of the intercontinental ballistic missiles, all of a sudden we have something that has a capability to reach the United States. Now, we set up some really comprehensive systems like the DEW line. It was great. We had a very powerful air defense system that was capable of dealing with the threats that existed at least up until the ICBM era. But then as we move forward from there, we moved into this concept of mutual assured destruction, which you all know this so well, but in my view, what this really did was it moved our defense of the country from a physical active defense to one in which we were depending on somebody else thinking very similarly, if not identically, to us. Nuclear warfare is simply too dangerous for both sides. Nobody would win, so there's not going to be any war. So we're okay at a high level threat area. All of this, I think, allowed us to develop and to employ a really unique view of war. I can't think of anybody else that's had this view of war for at least probably since Napoleon. And in essence, what that is every time that we have gotten into some sort of a serious problem with somebody, we've simply gone to wherever they were and done whatever we wanted to do to them, beat them up as much as necessary in order to win. We went there, we fought the wars there, we didn't fight them here, which meant we didn't have any particular worry or fear over strategic retaliation. And by strategic retaliation, what I'm really mean is any of those enemies saying, okay, fine, you attack my capital, I'm going to attack your capital, and so on and so forth. Simply has not been there. And this has given us, rightfully so, an enormous amount of confidence in our arms and in our ability to sort of manage any situation. Some of them we did a little bit better than others, but basically this was the methodology that we used. Now we've come up to a different situation. And that different situation is this, that for the first time, for a long time, we have a peer competitor. Now, a little bit different than these guys from the Trojan War, but what in essence it is a peer competitor is an enemy who can do anything to you that you can do to him. So that means that that both sides are strategically, operationally, tactically vulnerable. Both sides can attack into strategic, operational, and tactical depths, which means that everything is on the board. And to sort of repeat the thing from before, the last time we actually fought a war with a peer competitor was, in fact, with the British in the War of 1812. Long time. Now, let's take a look at who this peer competitor really is. And it's obviously we're talking about China. It looks to me like that even now that China probably has the ability to cripple the United States, not to destroy it or to defeat it for sure, but to create an enormous amount of problems for it right now today. And it has a capability that in fact is growing at a rather impressive rate. So let's take a look at sort of three aspects of China as this peer competitor. One, the military, two, the geopolitical, and third, sort of the intent and the culture. So from a military standpoint, you have a nation, a country that has largest army, largest navy, second largest air force, perhaps growing to be the largest air force, an impressive ICBM capability, only globally tested hypersonic vehicle, proven cyber warfare capability, proven biological warfare capability, pretty interesting space program aiming for a base on the moon, I think as far as I know, a unique balloon capability, and although we don't think about it as a threat, they have a very, very competent defense capability, ranging from fallout shelters, civil defense, through abilities, air defense, as well as missile defense. So pretty interesting, pretty well done from their standpoint. From the geopolitical standpoint, you have the second largest, almost the largest country in the world, second largest GDP, and with some forecasting that it will be the largest before the end of this decade, largest shipbuilding capability, largest steel production capability, largest automobile production capability, with those last three things all having the ability to shift very, very rapidly into war production, if that should happen to be the case. They have what would appear to be the most dangerous and the most competent espionage organization that we have ever faced, that ranges from internal subversion all the way through standard listening kinds of things and bases around the world. From an intent and culture standpoint, I think that maybe the most outstanding thing is the words of Xi Jinping, who has said that by 2049, the 100th anniversary of the Chinese communist takeover of China with the defeat of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, he has said that by 2049, China will be dominant in the world militarily and economically. That's us right now. What he's saying is that the United States is no longer going to be number one, which means it's number 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, or maybe even farther down the line. There's an interesting thing about Xi, that he very rarely talks about his predecessors. The one guy that he does talk about is Mao Zedong. Now, I know a lot of people think, oh, Mao Zedong, this is a guy that was around 75 years ago. He's long forgotten. And anyway, wasn't he the guy that did the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward and all the rest of the stuff? And wasn't he the guy that ended up killing maybe as many as 80 million Chinese? And isn't he hated by Chinese because everybody has some family member or ancestor that was one of these victims? But that turns out not to be the case. In fact, that even this minute, he is lying in state in a very nice mausoleum in the middle of Tiananmen Square, through which millions of Chinese pass on a yearly basis. Every day, lines of people out there where you can walk by and get about a 10-second view of the great man as they pass rapidly through this mausoleum. You say, well, so what do we care about that? I think that the one thing that is of particular interest, and maybe particular interest to you all, is his view on nuclear warfare. He was asked, he said, well, you're doing some things that are that could get you in a war with the United States, and that could be a nuclear war. And aren't you afraid of that? And he said, no, frankly, so I'm not particularly afraid of nuclear war. Because look, so we, at the time we had a population of maybe 600 million. He said, in a nuclear war, we might lose 300 million people, but we would have 300 million left. And that would be far more than anybody else. So no, I'm not real worried about that. So anybody that thinks that way, not just from the nuclear standpoint, probably is representative of a culture which probably cannot be deterred in the same way that we thought about deterrence with the Soviets in the Cold War period. What might China's strategy be? Well, surprisingly, the answer is probably in the first Gulf War. And why do we say that? There was a book called Unrestricted Warfare that has been widely circulated through the Chinese military and read, and through the Chinese bureaucracy. And it's in the very beginning had this statement. It said the Gulf War was a war which changed the world and ultimately changed war itself. Now, we know the Chinese are pretty darn good about copying things, and they're more than just copiers. They look at something, they figure out ways to improve it, and so on and so forth. So if this is how they feel about the first Gulf War, well, then for certain that they have studied it and that they have taken whatever lessons they thought were useful. So why would they have been as taken by the first Gulf War as apparently they were? Well, from their standpoint, what they were looking at is something like this: that so a war took place, and it ended up with the country, its army, paralyzed. From their view, we had realized our objectives, and had done a war in 42 days, of which 38 days were air operations, and only lost 150 people. And although we worry about losing 150 people, from a Chinese standpoint, this would be losses were inconsequential or insignificant, et cetera, et cetera. As they look at it a little more deeply, they say, what did this do? What did they accomplish with the air campaign? Well, they got air supremacy, which meant then that they basically were in control of Iraq. Imposed strategic paralysis on the government, the military, the country, confined it within narrow borders, took their army, the 500,000-man army that was in Kuwait, destroyed its command and control, drove its logistics below survival level, and imposed over 50% attrition on its heavy equipment. In other words, that simply made that army virtually useless, with the exception of a couple units that were way outside the general periphery. So if we move from there down to a little bit more specificity, I think that there is two things that really stand out that are relevant to what the Chinese probably picked up, and also relevant to how we need to be thinking about how they might attack us. The first was that this was the first time that there was a genuine strategic parallel attack on a system. And what we found was that this parallel attack, very short, it's overwhelming, and it was, for practical purposes, it was pretty much irresistible. What was it? It was, within the first hours of the war, bringing a handful of key targets or centers of gravity, which is another important part of this, under near simultaneous attack, compressing the attack so much that you ended up getting an effect that was dramatically beyond what would be the arithmetic accumulation of the damage. It was simply a different kind of a thing. Strategic operational paralysis happens in hours, not months or years. Very low cost in blood and treasure for us. Broke the system elastic limits of Iraq, which basically meant that there was no possible competent system response. So just to expand on this just a little bit, a quick comparison with what happened in World War II. In 1943, in January of 1943, 8th Air Force began air attacks on Germany proper. And in that time hit 50 targets that were spaced out pretty much on about one a week, simply because we were trying to get enough airplanes together to do things. So 50 targets, target areas, complexes done over a year period was something that the Germans found entirely manageable. Collect 500,000 people and send them to fix things when they were broken. Luftwaffe improves after every strike that goes in. It was very expensive for Germany, but Germany was still pretty much functioning as a system and still quite capable at the end of 1943. Compare that with what happened to Iraq. 150 targets, complexes of equivalents struck in 24 hours. That's a multiple order of magnitude difference in what happened to Germany, and different sets of targets and so on and so forth. So this concept of a parallel attack is something that we really need to grasp, and I don't think that we have particularly well, because it is so much different from the serial kinds of operations that have been part and parcel of military, of war for thousands of years. It's simply a different thing when you can compress the time and make things kind of, if you will, implode. This is a different kind of a problem. So what else? Well, the other thing I think that they took out of this was the use of, or the identification and the attack of centers of gravity. Now, when we put this together, we use this system called the 5 rings system, which is really, it's nothing more than a template that you can overlay an enemy, you can use it in the business world for that matter also. And this template says that everything has this organization, that in the center there's leadership, and then there are critical processes, things like electrical systems, et cetera. There's infrastructure, roads and bridges, there's population, demographic groups, and then on the outside are fielded forces. So the way that you use this is that you lay out your objectives for a war or an operation or whatever, and you look through and say, okay, who are the leadership, or what are the leadership elements in our opponent that we need to change in order to realize our objectives? I'll give you an example of how that was done in the first Gulf War to show you what these things really mean in addition. So leadership, first Gulf War, clearly that was Saddam Hussein and some of his key lieutenants, and some of the things like the Ba'ath Party. The critical processes included things like the electrical system, the communication system, the weapons of mass destruction program, and the refining of petroleum for conversion into jet fuel, diesel fuel, gasoline, et cetera. Infrastructure, primarily in this case, roads and bridges. Demographic groups, in this case, aimed at the psychological operations, aimed at the conscript class of the Iraqi army in Kuwait, and then a handful of the fielded forces, primarily initial emphasis on the air offense and the air defense side of it. So this worked out pretty well. And you think about this in a remarkably short period of time. These things weren't all destroyed, but that they all stopped functioning at the level that they were expected to function at in order to keep a country going. And the impact was really, really hard to grasp. Now, there's another way to look at this thing, and something which I suspect all of you are intensely familiar with. But this was something that several years ago, actually 20 years ago now, I guess, when it first came out, that mathematicians, Barabasi, Bonobo, and some others came up with this idea what the internet really looked like, and decided it was really a scale-free organization in which a handful of nodes had multiple links, but the majority of the links didn't have any particular connections, or the majority of the nodes on the outside. So these nodes that are in here, we think about today, if you wanted to put names on them, there's Google, there's CloudStrike, there's Microsoft, and you all know this quite well. The interesting thing about this from a center of gravity standpoint is that this provides you another way to find the centers of gravity and to think about how things are actually put together. And it's good to think about the fact that the majority of the nodes in this system don't have very many links. The nodes that have lots of links are almost certain to be centers of gravity. How can we use this? Well, we can hypothesize, and I think accurately so, that the whole country itself is really one of these scale-free networks. Looks about the same. So we've got the nation that's up here. Then we can look underneath and say, well, here are the critical processes, the electrical, energy, agriculture, and so on and so forth, and they all mirror conceptually what the overall country looks like. And we can, in fact, put our 5 rings over it in order to find where the real leadership things are in there. And then we can continue that down. And because this 5-ring pattern repeats itself in a fractal form down into all of these other things, it gives us an enormously good way to find things for both offense and for defense. The things that we hit in Baghdad in the first 24 hours, if Washington had been hit, it would have looked like this. It won't go into detail on these, but all of these things, entities, people, etc., would have been affected in one form or another. And after that first few hours, after that first day of attack, none of this stuff would be functioning at the way that it was designed to function, and which it really had to function in order to make smart strategic decisions and do things and so forth. So many of you all are there in Washington, and my recollection from my time in the Potomac, that a quarter of an inch of snow could bring the whole place to a standstill. Imagine what would happen if all of these things are a little bit broken, some of them completely broken, and it happens within 24 hours. We had strategic effects in the first Gulf War. That's what the Chinese have seen. It was done with conventional weapons. In the first Gulf War, those weapons were almost strictly air vehicles, aircraft, cruise missiles. They were able to get in, penetrate with acceptable loss rates, or else they were expendable in the case of cruise missiles. And they could precisely destroy the function of targets, not necessarily create an enormous amount of just sheer destruction, but they could destroy the function of targets very, very accurately and very capably. Now, so strategic effects with conventional weapons, that was then, this is now. These are the handful of the things that I can think of that can be used effectively to create strategic effects that were not previously there. cyber hypersonic beams, EMP, and incident, not nuclear generated EMP, but conventionally generated EMP, biological sabotage, balloons. And this last one, you say, well, why putting in that? That's not an attack mechanism, that's a defense mechanism. But that gives somebody, if you've got that homeland defense capability, that gives you an enormous amount of freedom of action to do a variety of other things that you otherwise might not feel that you have. So if in fact that the Chinese have been thinking this way and are developing their operations or their concept of operations based largely or even significantly on what they think happened in the first Gulf War, what would their targets be in the United States? Well, as you would imagine, it would be leadership things, and not strictly in Washington, but a lot of them there. It would be these critical systems, electricity, refining, communications, etc. It would be a lot of infrastructure kinds of things. It would be various demographic groups that might be swayed to move in one direction or another, and then some fielded forces, and particularly the things that represented a strategic threat to China, like airplanes, missiles, submarines. Now, can they do this? And I think that the answer, unfortunately, is yes, that every one of these things that they have tested in one form or another, and at least have a developing capability actually to use against the homeland of the United States. Now, some of their attacks, if they did this, some of these things wouldn't work. Some of the machines wouldn't work, and some of the things would not accomplish what they thought it was. But if you just think about this, if the country as a system, the United States, is attacked with all of these things, and it's done in a pretty short period of time, like a day, even a couple or 3 days. I mean, you just think about what that does to a country that has never, or at least for well over 200 years, has never suffered anything, any significant damage to the country other than in spot places because of a hurricane or an earthquake or something of that sort. This is a completely different world, and it looks like the capability is, if not in a fielded form, at least is in an embryonic form, and is a genuine threat. Now, you all know this perfectly well, but I thought it was just sort of interesting to kind of lay out all of the critical systems and some of the infrastructure that you can think of that's important. And there are a bunch more. This is probably half of the things that probably ought to be on this list. But all of these things are out there. They are all interconnected, and every one of them is vulnerable, I believe, to virtually every one of those attack modes that we just showed. And they're not hard to do. I don't mean it wouldn't be a challenge to do it, but in concept, it is a fairly straightforward thing to use any of those capabilities against virtually any one of these targets. So given all this, we can look back a little bit and say, what are some of the concepts that were been validated over the last 25 years or so from the first Gulf War, and things which presumably the Chinese have learned reasonably well. So first off, is strategy is the sine qua non. You've got to have good strategy. If you have lousy strategy, it doesn't make any difference how good your equipment is or anything else. This idea of thinking about the enemy as a system, not as an air force, not as a navy, not as an army, but as a system that you want to affect in order to achieve your objectives. And you do that via centers of gravity that you can find using the 5 rings. Strategic and operational paralysis simply work very well. Air and space supremacy, once you have that, you basically control whatever is on the ground underneath you. This idea of time compression, time to victory, the shorter, the better. The shorter you keep it, the less the risk, the less the cost, and the higher the probability that you're going to be successful. Technological superiority is very important, but it becomes extraordinarily important when it is combined with new concepts of operations. So stealth, for example, the 117 not only was a great way to deliver weapons, but it played a big role in enabling this whole concept of parallel warfare, compressed warfare, keeping things short, etc. So what's needed from a U.S. standpoint? We got to be able to withstand a Chinese attack on the U.S. That means a comprehensive air, missile, space, cyber, bio, and civil defense. Means making U.S. systems and infrastructure robust. After an attack, we've got to have the ability to defeat China rapidly, which in my mind means overwhelming parallel air, space, sea, and cyber operations. We've got to really look at ourselves and make darn sure we don't have any, or certainly not too many, single point failure nodes. I think that we all would admit that there are a handful of those out there now, which are a little bit frightening. We need to optimize our intelligence, our organization, and our force structure. When you think about our organization and force structure, it looks pretty darn similar to the way that it looked when MacArthur was aboard the Missouri in Tokyo Bay in 1940. It was an organization and force structure that had been designed and worked quite well to allow a number of independent theater operations to take place. That's no longer what our challenge is. We need to plan for rapid mobilization and transition to war. We used to have some really good mobilization plans, but as far as I know, most of those things have kind of fallen into disuse and they're in some musty file cabinet someplace or other, but not getting a whole lot of current attention. And we need a lot of new revolutionary weapons, because if we don't have new revolutionary weapons by the time this war takes place, which isn't going to be tomorrow morning, probably, that the Chinese will have figured out ways to deal with B-2s, maybe even B-21s, and the whole other panoply of stuff that we have. If we can keep putting new stuff into the hopper that we can throw at them, then it means that it's going to be challenging for them to come up with proper defenses if they don't know what the darn things are going to be. So we summarize with this. I think we all must accept that our period of homeland invulnerability is simply gone, and that we've got to prepare for a war where the homeland is under attack and it's being done by a peer or greater opponent. We have to have a government-wide, military-wide strategy plan to win, a planning methodology. You know, we're really good at planning tactical operations, but our ability to think through and plan something like a war with a peer competitor, I don't think the mechanism is really there. Maybe you get lucky with some smart people in the right places at the right time, but I think we could do better. We could have a methodology. Need to understand that strategic attack wins or loses wars, and we sure don't want to be on the receiving end of that. This business of strategic paralysis it simply is decisive, and there are huge advantages to a first strategic attack or strike. Now, my guess is that the majority of you all would agree that if the United States was attacked strictly with the conventional weapons, the way we have just laid out, that it would be a very difficult and probably an unlikely decision for any administration to say, well, okay, so they attacked, they dropped some bombs on us, so now it unleashed the whole nuclear force, and it's all out nuclear war. Don't think that that's going to happen, nor do I think that there's much of a chance that we would say, well, it looks like the Chinese are going to attack, even with just conventional weapons, so we're going to go first. So we simply have got to have this comprehensive strategic defense. I think it's absolutely critical. We have to have a lot of different ways to attack and defend. We need to stay away from this serial war, the single thing that happens, and then there's another event and so on. And we sure don't want to get into an attrition war with a country that has 5 times our population. Very simply, there is no substitute for victory, and we need to prepare now to win. So I'm going to finish this with just a quick postscript. I don't I don't know that for sure that there is going to be a war, but I think that the probability, and I mean a war, I don't mean a Taiwan war, but I mean a war against the United States by China. I think the probability is high enough. Maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 20%, but it is high enough. It is existent enough that it would be criminally negligent not to prepare for it, because that the consequences of not being prepared and losing are simply unbearable to even think about, let alone to have them happen. So there are things that we need to do. And then I want to leave you with sort of this last idea here from Giulio Douhet, who was one of the first of the theorists of air power, Italian general. He said, "Victory smiles upon those who anticipate the changes in the character of war, not upon those who wait for the changes to take place." So with that, I thank you very much, and I look forward to questions. And in the event that, as Tom said early on, here's our website. There's some additional stuff in here that you might find interesting. If you want to get in touch, here is a couple of emails and phone number, etc.